An aspect of the pandemic that we don't much discuss is that many of us are living in a form of grief, having lost many experiences, not to mention potentially loved ones. We're entering into a space we're unfamiliar with. In this conversation, I speak to David Kessler, an authority on grief, about the 5 stages of grief and the way that they vary and mutate and are expressed through individual grieving processes, his personal experiences with loss, and how you can handle grief, mourning, and pain and suffering, even that's not necessarily related directly to the death of a human being, differently and hopefully better. I'm scared of grief. I'm scared of it. Like, you know that famous maxim of like grief is the price we pay for love. Like sometimes with my animals, I remember it with my cat that's he died last year. I remember that, and with pretty much everybody actually, I sort of like try to conceive of their death while I'm with them. I try to sort of, both from a perspective of acceptance, but also in a kind of weird infatuation way. Is there a positive way of sort of mobilizing that idea, accepting the inevitability of literal and bodily death without it becoming like sort of obsessive and fetishistic or something?
Well, I think I've had to adopt a different view of all that. First of all, there's a healthy thing called anticipatory grief, that when a pet's getting older, or when our parents are getting older, we sort of know we're going to lose them someday and have this healthy adaptation that our mind is trying to grapple with. So that's the healthy part of it. I certainly, dealing with this my whole life, have had to really reckon with love and grief are a package deal on planet Earth. Grief is actually optional. You don't want to grieve ever, you don't have to. But you can't fall in love, you can't have friends, you can't attach to pets, you can't love your children or your parents. When I realize all that, I'm like, well, I don't want to make the journey without love. I mean, I want to come here and love, and it means I'm going to lose someday. I'm going to lose the people I love, the pets I love, the things I love. That's part of this travel we all do.
Can you tell us about your formative experience of grief, the loss of your mother, and then how the later grief, the loss of your son, which I'm obviously sorry to hear about, and of your mother, of course, but especially the loss of a child. Can you tell me how those two experiences of grief differ and how they affected and changed you and how you dealt with them?
Sure. It's I'm in a profession that in some ways you don't choose, it kind of chooses you. No third grader is like, oh, I want to be a death and a grief expert when I grow up. I had a mother who was ill when I was growing up. And when I was about 13, she had to go to the hospital in the big city because she was very sick. I didn't know she was dying. And at the time she was dying, at the hotel across the street where we were, a shooting began. And it turned out it was one of the first mass shootings in the US. It's tragic we have them all the time now, but it was one of the first big ones. And in the span of 3 days, I wasn't able to be with my mother when she died. I saw hotel guests, police officers, and the chief of police died. And it's now used as what not to do in a shooting because they made so many mistakes. They just didn't know how to handle it at the time. And there was also racial overtones to it and so much of what we still deal with today. And that changed the trajectory of my life. I, tried to heal myself, there was no one there to help me with the trauma, with the grief. So that began my life of trying to help myself, help others. I was fortunate to work with some amazing people. My teacher became Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is a pioneer in the hospice world, along with your Cicely Saunders there in the UK. And they started hospice in our world. And she obviously came up with the 5 stages of dying. Over the years, I would talk about Elizabeth. Those stages are getting badly used for grief. And finally, we wrote a book called On Grief and Grieving, where we adapted her stages from dying to grief. The stages, for anyone not familiar with them, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. We literally on page 1 of the book said you don't do them in order. They're not a map. There's no one way to do grief. It's unique as our fingerprint. And it's interesting over the years how they've changed, because they've become these 5 easy steps for grieving. And Elizabeth and I both hated that then, and I hate it now. There's no 5 easy steps for grieving. And it's interesting on social media. Sometimes people will put in, oh, you and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross are just trying to neaten up our grief and make us follow your rules. And Elizabeth was a rule breaker. Elizabeth would hate this idea that there's these stages you're supposed to follow. So they've gotten a bad rap. The other thing is acceptance got a finality that we never intended. You know, when people say to me, how long am I going to grieve my loved one who died? I always go, well, how long is your loved one going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve them a long time. It doesn't always mean with pain. Hopefully in time you can grieve them with love. So that's kind of the background on the stages in a lot of my work. And then, as you mentioned a few years ago, after doing this for decades, I had adopted 2 children, 4 and 5 years old, from the LA County foster care system. My younger son was born drug exposed, and I really thought love would conquer all. And they had this amazing childhood. And it really was beautiful. I was shocked at sort of their turnaround and how well they were doing in life. And then at 16 years old, my son David called me one night and said, I'm in trouble. And I said, what's up? Where are you? What's going on? And he goes, I've used drugs. And I said, okay. And in my mind, I'm like, did you have a couple of beers? Did you have some pot? What did you do? And I go, well, what'd you do? What's going on? And he goes, I did crystal meth. And I'm like, wait, you're starting with crystal meth? And it was a hard road to comprehend. And I have certainly in my life been in program, been with Al-Anon. I sort of got it from my older perspective, but not this new world we're living in. And we spent the next 4 years, him going in and out of rehab and 12-step programs, and just a tumultuous road, a horrendous road, as anyone who's had to deal with knows. And he got sober. He was doing well, had his 21st birthday, had a wonderful girlfriend who was a social worker. And literally, I would say to him, David, I am seeing so many bereaved parents from addiction these days. Promise me I will never be a bereaved parent. And he's like, you will never be a bereaved parent. I'm sober now. And even when I wasn't, I knew what I was doing. And got the call one day that his girlfriend had had an argument that any 21-year-old has, called up some old friends. They went out and used. They lived, he died. Brutal.
What gets me is like the sort of mundanity of it, you know, like that it's just normal people doing normal stuff. Like kids take drugs, kids have arguments, and I've been around it because of my own recovery. I've been around it all my life because I was a drug addict from my late teens to my till I was 27, and I've been in recovery one day at a time since then. And so people dying as a result of their drug use or associated mental health issues, or, obviously, you know how many ways that can play out. It's become sort of normal. And because of that, I like feel like I want to be able to, as obviously you must, and when you said that thing of promise me I'm not going to be a bereaved parent, you want to be able to wrench it away. There's been a few drug addicts where I've gone like, do you know what I've almost found? I don't know how this chimes with your deeper experience, but almost like the more I sort of go, listen, this person definitely not. I'm gonna put myself as a shield between this person and the grave. Them ones, they're finished. You know what I mean? It's almost like the inability to control it, the inability to understand it, predict it, prevent it. I don't like. You obviously sort of indicated at the beginning of your story that there's possibly a fact of the early exposure prior to your son living with you is a factor. How did you begin to process and understand and accept the loss of your son?
I had it, it was really hard because I had to sit with, am I going to take the advice I gave everyone? And my advice was go to grief counseling, grief group. And I had to literally go to a grief group, took my contacts out, put my glasses on, put a cap on. I had to sit in grief groups with literally my books 4 feet away on a table.
Wow.
And not say, that's me. I'm the expert. I couldn't be him. I had to sit there and be the father who had to bury a son. That was a pretty humbling thing to have to do. I mean, it was, I now because of those experiences, when people walk into one of my grief groups or come online on a grief group or show up for counseling, I applaud now. Because I know now how hard it is just to walk in that room. I never got that before.
If you're enjoying this conversation, join me over at Luminary for the rest of our discussion. And for all the latest episodes of Under the Skin, go to luminarypodcast.com to start your free trial. See you there.